Today we're going to be talking about some findings from a project that Tara and I worked on with the Nebraska State Patrol and the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs to respond to LB 154 in looking at the scope of missing Native American women and children in Nebraska, as well as considering how to break down some barriers and improve the investigation and reporting of these cases. Go ahead, Tara, if you don't mind. So, thank you. Like I said, we collaborated with Nebraska State Patrol and the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs to team up to do a study that looked at missing Native persons in Nebraska, and like I said, respond to LB 154. Can you go to the next slide, which states what LB 154 mandated? So it essentially said that NSP needed to collaborate with the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs in order to conduct a study to determine how to increase state criminal justice protective and investigative resources for reporting and for identifying missing Native American women and children in Nebraska. So what Tara and I did, we knew that the LB 154 was coming down. We knew it was pretty much an unfunded mandate, didn't have any kind of monetary note attached to it. And so we contacted NSP and the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs and said, hey, we like to do research. This is a topic that we're interested in, and we might be able to bring a little bit more research capacity to this collaboration if you're interested. And they said they were. So we wrote a grant and submitted it to the National Institute of Justice, where we outlined some specific aims that are below, and I'll talk about those in just a minute, to specifically collaborate with NSP and the Nebraska Commission to basically look at LB 154. And we did get the grant, and that was really to support our research endeavors. And so what we came up with that again was in line with the mandate, but had some good research points specifically tied to it, were these three aims. And the first was to determine the scope of missing Native American women and children in Nebraska. The second was to identify barriers that existed in reporting and investigating these cases. And then the third was to basically take what we found out about number one and number two to identify and create some recommendations on what can be done in Nebraska to create partnerships between tribal and non-tribal entities in order to increase the reporting and investigating of missing Native women and children in Nebraska. Okay, so next slide. So before we jump into the results of the study, we want to just kind of lay a little bit of a foundation here for why the research in this area is so difficult to do. There are many challenges to identifying the number of missing persons that exist in a unit, a state or jurisdiction or whatever. The first, and potentially one of the more interesting ones, is the fact that adults can go missing by choice, and they have the right to do this. They may be experiencing violence in the home, and they want to get out of the home and not tell anybody where they're at. They could have financial problems that they're trying to get away from. In any case, they do have the right to go missing. Juveniles do not have this right. So another difficult part in determining how many missing persons there are in any one place is determining whether they have gone missing as a result of criminal or of non-criminal behavior. I mean, have they been kidnapped, or did they leave by their own volition and choice? The third one is a lack of policies that exist, which mandate that a missing person who's a case that's been reported has to be entered into a national data system for missing persons. And this could be for law enforcement, any kind of correctional agency, perhaps, that is, maybe probation that's being reported to, even victim services. But anyway, there's a lack of policies here that tells the agent to enter this missing person case into a national data system. The fourth one is a lack of standardized definitions of what a missing person is or means. And there's a lot of confusion too on on the part of community members that that thinks a missing person is not missing until they've been missing for a certain period of time, for instance, and then you can report them missing. So there's no standardized definitions here that we can rely on for research purposes. And then finally is the idea that adult status differs by sometimes jurisdiction or for sure state. So here in Nebraska, the age of majority is 19 years old, but it's 18 in most other states. And so that's going to lead, again, to some challenges in identifying who is actually missing and who you are mandated to report as missing. So Tara, thank you. Okay, now when we're talking specifically about Native Americans, these challenges are become even harder, or they're exacerbated for these cases. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. A big one is jurisdictional issues. A lot of questions come up regarding if the Native is a tribal member and of what tribe. Do they live on tribal lands, or are they off tribal lands? Did they go missing, or could they be on tribal lands missing, or could they be off of tribal lands missing? And all of these things really play a part in causing some confusion around who to report to. Do you go to tribal law enforcement, or do you go to non-tribal law enforcement? I mean, they are a member of the tribe, but they were living off the reservation. So who do you report to? It could also create some questions around which jurisdiction is supposed to respond to the case. Is it tribal law enforcement or non-tribal law enforcement? Another problem is that there seems to be a lack of coordination and a lack of relationships that exist between tribal and non-tribal law enforcement agencies. That does not mean that these relationships don't exist, because they do throughout the state, but to what degree they exist is the bigger question. And part of that is a lot of these relationships are almost like grassroots relationships, where a relationship or collaboration exists because, there's a really great sheriff who's working with the tribal law enforcement really well and has been doing so for many years. But as soon as that person promotes or retires, then those relationships potentially dissolve, or at least get weaker, because these kinds of collaborations are not institutionalized. And I think that's the bigger issue to emphasize here. And then finally, racial misclassification could and probably does exist when cases are entered into databases. And what I mean by that is a lot of times we see Native Americans being classified as 2 or more races with no specificity of what those 2 races are. Or they could just be misclassified as white entirely, or Hispanic, or something else, and not Native. And so that can really cause some problems in tracking the number of missing persons cases who are Native. Tara. Thank you. So when we put our heads together for this project, one of the things that we thought about was, hey, this is definitely a hidden population that is inherently difficult to study, inherently difficult to do research on and to measure. And there's really not a standard methodology that's proposed to collect some of these data because they're hidden populations. So our philosophy that we brought to this project was to say what we do, tell people exactly what we've done, and to be transparent about it. Do what we actually say we're going to do. That's an important one. And then to show our work. So when we reported out, when we sent out the report, we also sent our database, our working database with that report so that everyone who read the report could go to the data that we were analyzing and check it. And that's just part of being transparent in the scientific method. So I just want to tell everybody that the full report is available on our website as well as the data that we used. Tara. Thank you. So what did we do? And I'll go over some of the very important pieces, but maybe not as fun as what Tara gets to talk about in just a few minutes. This is our research methodology. So what did we do? Did we do what we say we were going to do? So we relied on two main sort of pieces of data. One was quantitative and one was qualitative. So the quantitative data, we took from 3 missing persons lists, and we created a point in time count of who the reported missing persons cases were in Nebraska. Now, I want to emphasize the importance of understanding that this is a point in time count, and essentially every other data pool that examines missing persons reported case lists is and should be considered a point in time count, because at any time those excuse me, names on that list could be taken off of the missing persons list. They could be found, the case could be closed, something like that. So please remember that these are point in time counts from what we are reporting here. Now, we did our data poll March 31st of 2020. And so like I said, we relied on 3 data systems to create this count. The first was the Nebraska Missing Persons List. The second was the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, also known as NamUs. And then the third was the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Missing Person List. So we took these missing persons lists, we compiled the names, we deleted the duplicate entries, and after that, we found that 498 missing persons cases in the state of Nebraska were unique and were identified at this data pool. And the cases spanned from June of 1940 to the day of our data pool, which was March 31st, 2020. So 498 unique missing persons in Nebraska is what we found. We also supplemented this data with qualitative data. We did listening sessions with tribal communities in Omaha, where there were about 38 people, Santee, there were 18, Macy, 15, and in Winnebago, where we had 39 participants. And we had a lot of questions, at those listening sessions, we got to cover a lot of ground about the problem of missing persons, perhaps why natives went missing, and some of the barriers to reporting, as well as some things to think about to improve these. And Tara will get to talk about those in just a minute, what we found. We also collected missing persons policies from law enforcement departments across the state. So we emailed 212 law enforcement departments across the state. Do you have a missing persons policy? And if you do, can you send it to us? And we received responses from 51 departments in Nebraska. Next slide, please, Tara. Thank you. So I'll get into the broad findings, and then Tara gets to go over some of the more nitty-gritty ones. So the missing person rate for Nebraska on March 31st, 2020 was 25 persons per 100,000 persons, okay? Of these missing persons, a disproportionate number are Black. They represent about 3.9 times their population in Nebraska as missing persons, or Native American, and they represent about 3.1 times their number in the Nebraska population as missing persons. So we also found that the majority of missing Native Americans are males who are under the age of 17 years old, and nearly almost 75% of the Native American missing persons were boys who were this age or younger, okay? We also found that more Native American missing persons are minors, and that more Native American missing persons cases remain open or unsolved longer than the total missing persons cases in Nebraska. So those are some pretty big findings, Tara. And this just graphically shows you some of the numbers I gave you. So if you look at the darker line or bar here, you see that's the Nebraska population, and the lighter one represents the missing persons population in Nebraska. So, for instance, 88% of Nebraskans are white, while 67% of Nebraska missing persons are white. If you go up to the Black bars here, you'll see that 5% of the Nebraska population is Black, but they make up almost 20% of the Nebraska missing persons. So that's that disproportionality that you see. Same thing with Native Americans. They make up about 1.5% of the Nebraska population, but they comprise a little over 4.5% of the Nebraska missing persons. So that's where you see the disproportionality. I want to emphasize that we will only talk about the Native American missing cases from here on out, even though African American missing cases is an important thing to consider, and they are disproportionately represented. But because we were following LB 154, we focused specifically on Native Americans. Okay, Tara. I think that's you, right?
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Wright. I'm Dr. Tara Richards. Like Dr. Wright said, I'm her colleague in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at UNO. I'm really thrilled to share some of the findings from our collaboration. Before I get started, just two little housekeeping things. One, as Dr. Wright mentioned, we do have funding from the National Institute of Justice. So let me be clear that the findings we're presenting here today are our findings, and they do not speak on behalf of the National Institute of Justice. And also that I do not identify as Native American or Indigenous. And so I want to be clear that I am not speaking on behalf of Native Americans or Indigenous persons in the state of Nebraska. We are simply sharing the findings of our research as social scientists. So as Dr. Wright mentioned, we did find that Native American persons are disproportionately represented as missing persons cases or reported missing persons in Nebraska. When we did our data poll, we predominantly use the Nebraska Missing Persons List. So basically we started with the Nebraska Missing Persons List, and then we cross-checked that with the two national missing persons lists, the NamUs list and the NCMEC list. So what we found was the vast majority of Native American missing persons in Nebraska were on the Nebraska Missing Persons List. So in regard to reported missing persons cases, the Nebraska Missing Persons List really is highly comprehensive and accurately tracks the reported missing persons cases. So I think this is important because this really demonstrates that of cases that are reported to Nebraska's law enforcement agencies, they are making it onto the missing persons list. Which is, sort of the lowest bar that we would want in terms of high quality reporting, right? Is for folks that are reporting missing persons cases, they're getting on the missing persons list in the state. So we did find that all of Nebraska's Native American missing persons were on the Nebraska Missing Persons List. There was some crossover such that there were some cases that were also on NamUs. However, there was no Native American missing persons cases listed on the NCMEC. As Dr. Wright mentioned, we really had the good fortune of being the researchers on this project, but Captain Matt Sutter with the Nebraska State Patrol really led this effort given the LB 154 mandate, and we were very lucky to have access to the Nebraska State Patrol missing persons analyst, and she was fantastic in answering a lot of our questions. And one of them was, why might this be? Why might Native American missing persons or missing kids not be on the NCMEC? And what we really found was that it really has to do with sort of selection bias, in that cases that make it on the NCMEC really are cases that have been referred to sort of specialty units within law enforcement where they believe there is exploitation, evidence of exploitation. So perhaps a child being used for pornography, right? And these are the types of cases that would be on the NCMEC. We also, in addition to looking at the state and national missing persons lists, understanding that this was really only going to give us data on reported cases, at all of the listening sessions, both Captain Sutter from Nebraska State Patrol and a project coordinator from the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs asked the community members that were there about cases that were unreported. So basically, Captain Sutter said, if you as a community member know about a case that hasn't been reported, I'm here. He said that over the course of the project, he gave out over 500 business cards as he was not only going to these community listening sessions, but also doing other community outreach, saying, please tell me about it. I'm here to help you make that report. Also understanding there's going to be cases where the community just does not feel comfortable reporting to law enforcement. That project coordinator, who was a UNL law student who was working for the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs, also made herself available and said, if you don't feel comfortable reporting to law enforcement, please come and talk to me. I can help you make a report to NamUs. You don't have to make a report to law enforcement. And based on this outreach to the community, we had no new cases reported. So, we want to be clear, and we'll talk about the limitations, that the data that we have is the universe of reported cases. But we did make real efforts to try to identify unreported cases, and we were just not successful. So Dr. Wright mentioned the fact that we had unique cases, that we were interested in unique cases. So we did find some duplicate entries when we looked across the missing persons data set. So specifically, we found when we looked at the Nebraska Missing Persons List that the same person may have been reported missing several times over the, over a year or maybe several years. And so we went again to the Nebraska State Patrol Missing Persons Analyst and said, what could be going on here? And she gave us a whole host of reasons why somebody would remain on the list, not be taken off, and then report it again later. So basically, you know, from her perspective, these were cases of someone who had gone missing more than once, and they had simply not been, the case had not been closed, right? And there could be a host of reasons. It could be that the person who originally entered the case did not have, you know, the level of training to understand that when the case was closed, it should come off. It could also be that law enforcement didn't know that the case was closed, right? So the person was returned home, you know, safe and sound, and that was never reported into law enforcement. It could also be that when the case was reported in, there was some error in the reporting, in the information, meaning perhaps there was a slight misspelling of the name, or it could have been a racial misclassification. And so when the agency went to take that information down, they couldn't find it because there was a mismatch between what they were looking for and what had actually been entered into the system. So what we did was we identified the list of duplicates. We sent it to the Nebraska State Patrol Missing Persons Analyst, and we had her cross-check that to make sure that we didn't inadvertently draw down or remove a case from our data set that really wasn't a unique case, where there really wasn't a duplicate entry. So as Dr. Wright said, in addition to the quantitative data, we were fortunate to be able to attend 4 listening sessions across Native communities in the state. And these community listening sessions really focused on the underlying or potential underlying factors in missing persons cases in Native communities. I don't think we mentioned this, but we did have a tribal judge, Judge William Thorne, come from Colorado to facilitate these listening sessions. He had been used to facilitate other listening sessions in another statewide study previous to this one. And so, you know, and has just tons and tons of experience with facilitating these types of listening sessions and just did a really phenomenal job. So I just want to publicly say thank you to him again for his work on this. So when we, at the listening sessions, there was a series of sort of social challenges that were identified as underpinning missing persons cases, or why persons may go missing from Native communities. So some of those challenges include domestic violence, human trafficking, substance use, poverty, lack of affordable housing. So really factors that could be aligned with criminal activity, things like domestic violence and human trafficking, where someone may not go missing by their own volition, right? As well as things like lack of affordable housing and poverty, where someone may leave the community sort of in search of better things, but you know, that's sort of unbeknownst to the community members. I'll also sort of make clear that this underlying challenge around domestic violence is very complicated because without having a lot of information on individual case context, you may have a case where someone is involved in domestic violence as a survivor, and they leave an abusive situation and they don't want to be found. We heard just really some phenomenal information from victim service providers who talked about having survivors in you know, safe shelter, and knowing that they are quote unquote missing, but they've gone missing on purpose and they don't want to be found and they don't want their whereabouts shared. And of course, you know, Native communities are close knit. There's, you know, they're small, and so it's you know, if you're going to keep your whereabouts secret, right? It really means, in some cases, telling no one. So those victim service providers really feeling this tension of, knowing that they're protecting this person's safety, but also knowing that there are loved ones out there potentially fearing, for their safety, wondering where they are. So really having to keep that confidentiality. At the same time, we know that domestic violence can be lethal. So you can understand those loved ones wondering, is this person somewhere safe and hidden, or is this person not safe, right? So that is a very challenging issue to really sort of unpack. Human trafficking is another potential criminal activity that could be associated with missing persons cases that were identified. Substance use and mental health challenges. These are also complicated because on the one hand, persons could go missing on their, on their own volition. And on the other hand, this can really complicate reporting because family members may not want to report a case if their loved one is involved in or potentially involved in criminal activity because they don't want to potentially get this person in trouble, right? If there is a warrant for their arrest, they may not want to bring attention to this person or this person's whereabouts. So again, really complicated underlying factors with missing persons cases. So Dr. Wright talked a little bit about what the literature, reveals in terms of barriers to reporting and investigating missing persons cases that involve Native American persons, but the listening sessions also sort of reinforced and highlighted some of these challenges. So again, and I know Dr. Wright talked about this, the absence of relationships between law enforcement and tribal communities, or their historical mistrust, perhaps, a lack of communication between all of the multiple agencies that may be working within Native American communities, given the different jurisdictions. Perceptions by community members that nothing is going to be done if they report, or that there may be some sort of negative consequence in reporting. So as I previously discussed, perhaps someone who has a substance abuse challenge, right? So being afraid that if I report this person as missing, it may end up with them involved in the criminal justice system or more deeply entrenching them in the criminal justice system. As Dr. Wright mentioned, about 2/3 of missing persons cases are teenagers and kids, right? And this is also true of Native American missing persons cases. So in these community listening sessions, community members talked about being very concerned that reporting a missing persons case, especially a case that involved an adolescent or a teenager, was going to result in involvement of child protective services. Perhaps that teenager had been involved in the juvenile justice system and they didn't want to get this kid in further trouble. So really this tension between wanting to make sure that their community members are safe, but also not wanting to cause more trouble for community members or inadvertently make the situation worse. There was also a real lack of understanding around how and when to report a missing persons case. This is really what we found was that there is sort of this myth that you need to wait 24 or 48 hours or 72 hours to report a missing persons case. And you could really see, the frustration in our Nebraska State Patrol counterparts and saying, no, you need to report a missing persons case as soon as possible, because every minute that goes by, we're losing evidence, right? Like we're losing witnesses. Like, don't wait 3 days because, at that point, the whole dynamic has changed. And then also misunderstandings or lack of information on behalf of community members about how to report. So, there's some tension between, if I call law enforcement and I tell them that this person is missing, they're sort of known in our community to maybe to have a mental health challenge or to have substance abuse problems. So nobody's going to believe me or take me seriously. Now, of course, we didn't find any evidence of cases where that had happened, but that's a concern for community members. So they need alternative reporting, avenues for reporting, and NAMIS is one of those alternative avenues. So they can report a missing persons case on their own to NAMIS. Now, that missing persons case is not going to go live and be public until it's cross-checked with law enforcement, right? Until a law enforcement agency actually says, yes, this is a missing persons case. But it gets the information in there. And then if a law enforcement officer comes upon that information, if they get a report, or perhaps in a different jurisdiction, it's a teenager, they come across this kid, the information is out there, right? And it's in a database that's searchable to law enforcement. So it's sort of a stepping stone, if you will, for folks that don't want to report to law enforcement, or for whatever reason there's a barrier that law enforcement does not choose to take that case, right? Uses their discretion and not take that missing person's case. So we also looked at missing persons policies from law enforcement agencies across the state. So again, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Nebraska State Patrol, and particularly Captain Matt Sutter, because he was, really, he used a lot of social capital, I know, to reach out to agencies and make it possible for agencies to share these policies with us. So again, we sent an invitation to leadership at 212 law enforcement agencies across the state. This was tribal and non-tribal law enforcement agencies. We had two fantastic doctoral students that were helping us with this. They sent emails for emails that bounced back, or for folks that we didn't hear from, they made phone calls, and they really, it was a Herculean effort to make sure that we at least made contact, and we knew we had made contact. So we either received an email back or we spoke with someone on the phone, really in an effort to identify whether agencies had a policy, and then for those that did, to know what was in that policy. So the first thing that we identified was that not all agencies have missing persons policies. And I will say, one sort of small success story was that a couple of the agencies that didn't have missing persons policies reached out to Captain Sutter during the project and said, we don't have a missing persons policy, but we should. So would you share Nebraska State Patrol's policy? Of course, Captain Sutter was like, yes, of course I will. So, really, there's we don't suggest there's anything nefarious going on. It's just that we wanted to identify, does every agency have a policy, and if they do, is there overlap? And what we found was that there really is wide variability across different jurisdictions' policies. So, we all understand that by both state and federal law, if a juvenile is reported missing, that report has to be taken. That child's information has to be put on the missing persons list. But law enforcement have a lot of discretion when it comes to adults, and it really wasn't clear sort of what types of cases or what case context would lead to a case being taken, and then that information being reported up to the missing persons list. There was also not any sort of clear timeline for law enforcement taking a report or entering it into the missing persons, any of the missing persons lists, nor was there any sort of consistency regarding what type of information would be taken in a missing persons incident report. And then, of course, for our purposes, since we were really interested in identifying Native American missing persons, whether or not demographic information would be collected, and if it was, how it would be collected. So, you know, would that law enforcement officer be using their own judgment, maybe based on a picture of the person, to identify their race or ethnicity, or whether or not they were a Native American person? Or would they be asking the person that made the report? Would they be asking about tribal affiliation? Would that vary based on the area of the state? So, for example, if you were in a jurisdiction that was adjacent to a reservation, maybe you would get that level of information. But if you were, say, in Omaha, maybe you wouldn't. And that just wasn't clear. That level of information just wasn't clear. So through both, through primarily the listening sessions, there were really, I think, some great findings regarding potential partnerships. So at one of the listening sessions in particular, there was a great conversation about, you know, not just tribal and non-tribal law enforcement, better, you know, having stronger partnerships, or law enforcement and the community having stronger partnerships, but also using what we might think of as non-traditional allies. And, you know, this, for those in law enforcement or victim service providers, you may say, well, of course, you know, we do this with human trafficking, we do this with, you know, child abuse and neglect. But this, you know, was something that, you know, came up very organically in the listening sessions regarding how law enforcement could partner with tattoo artists, right? Or folks working at the casinos, or folks that work at convenience stores, to try to help identify folks who were potentially, you know, being trafficked, or were, you know, involved in some sort of criminal activity that was associated with missing persons. There was also the real need for community education that was identified in community listening sessions. So really, community education around how and when to report a missing person's case to law enforcement. This sort of came up over and over and over in community listening sessions. Also, the need to understand how and when you could use NamUs. You know, NamUs is, you know, a national program. It is supported by the Department of Justice, and there are regional trainers that will come out and do these trainings for community members. Dr. Wright and I actually had the good fortune of going to a training really just sort of by chance a few years ago, when we attended a conference at UNO on victims of crime in Indian country. And NamUs came and really put on a fantastic presentation about how NamUs could be used really to sort of help respond to missing Native American persons. And then also there was lots of discussion about other types of partnerships beyond law enforcement. So just to remind everybody, LB 154 really was a law enforcement mandate. And since Nebraska State Patrol was the legally mandated agency, you know, they were really looking for recommendations that were actionable for Nebraska State Patrol, right, and for law enforcement. But we also recognize that there are lots of other state and community partners that will play a role in, you know, helping to respond to this issue and these underlying social challenges. So getting to the recommendations. So again, you know, recommendation number one really is, is all about increasing ways that Nebraska State Patrol could sort of respond. So the recommendations that are in pink on all of these slides are things that have already been implemented. So, you know, there was really, so I think Captain Sutter and the Nebraska State Patrol was really trying to balance using the data that was gathered through this report to advance recommendations that they thought would be effective, with also understanding the real variety of law enforcement agencies across the state, right? So understanding that, a one-size-fits-all mandate is probably not going to work for every single agency. But what we could say was it probably makes sense for every agency to have a missing persons policy, to have it on paper so that, community members understand what a missing persons report is supposed to look like, what information is going to be taken, so that it's consistent across every single report, every single officer. And whenever possible, to get information on the race of the missing person, right? Especially given the focus on Native American persons and Native American communities. We also recommended that, if possible, information on potential tribal affiliation would also be important to gather when taking that missing persons report. There were also a couple of recommendations that Nebraska State Patrol could act on pretty immediately in their conversations with tribal law enforcement, with tribal councils, as these listening sessions were being held, and that included bringing back a cross-deputization program that had never really gone away, but had really been dormant for a few years. Developing and implementing a cultural awareness program for Nebraska State Patrol officers. That has been ongoing for months now, and it's being, at least it has been, I don't know what the future of it is, but it has been, the trainer has been just really a wonderful victim service provider from Legal Aid, who is both a Native American woman and also an expert on domestic violence and human trafficking in Native American communities. She does, education and outreach for Legal Aid. So, just we understand that the training is really fantastic, and we expect that it would be very effective in sort of raising awareness around the culture and of Native American communities, and also sort of the history and challenges that these communities experience. And then also trying to increase the recruitment of Native American persons into the Nebraska State Patrol, and then allowing them to stay in their home area so that you have more Native American troopers that are or State Patrol officers that are in these jurisdictions, right? So when there are jurisdictional issues, hopefully you have NSP folks that come from these communities, so they already have the established relationships that can then become more and more institutionalized over time. The second recommendation was really to enhance the awareness of reporting options and mechanisms for reporting to Native American communities. So again, as previously mentioned, responding to these requests about training for NamUs, working with these other state stakeholders like the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education to make sure that there's education in schools. There's, and in the Nebraska's tribal colleges and universities, to make sure that kids and teens and youth and emerging adults really understand how to make these reports, what some of the underlying challenges are, what some of the risk factors are. And then also to really try to encourage each Nebraska tribe to hold regular meetings with law enforcement and other actors, other partners, so that tribes really sort of have an ongoing task force, if you will, so that as these challenges evolve, as recommendations are implemented, we can sort of monitor whether things are working, whether you need to pivot, make a change. And so you're not just implementing recommendations with no follow through, right? And no sort of, oversight around their fidelity. The third was really awareness around the potential interrelatedness of missing persons and human trafficking and other social challenges. So the Nebraska State Patrol has made available their human trafficking training to tribal law enforcement agencies, as well as tribal casinos and hotels, really trying to raise that level of awareness. There was also recommendations, again, around engaging with other state stakeholders, and then also engaging with victim service providers, so at the local nonprofits, to really try to provide sort of holistic support and services to the loved ones of missing persons. And then especially for teens and youth who are potentially in the situation where they continuously go missing, really trying to address the underlying factors that are resulting in them going missing or running away, depending on the situation. So of course, with any study, this study has limitations. So first, we want to be transparent and say that you may have remembered that back in March, when we were really sort of in the heat of doing this study. This was really when COVID-19 was becoming a real issue, and we were not able to go out to Western Nebraska and do a listening session there. And that was it was a huge disappointment. We really wanted to go out and address those community members, and it just didn't happen. We also were not able to complete any one-on-one interviews with law enforcement during the study period, and we really wanted to do that because we know that, especially given the LB 154 mandate, really understanding the law enforcement perspective is important. We also, recognize that we are dealing with a hidden population here, right? Missing persons are inherently hidden; they're inherently missing. So the number of and the universe of missing persons that are unreported are not represented here, and by no means is this going to be a comprehensive picture of missing persons cases. And we just have to continue to do the research, and that's ongoing. Our research is ongoing, and it's ongoing in other states. So the state of Arizona had very similar legislation, and they have a partnership with Arizona State University. That report should be coming out soon. The state of Idaho had similar similar legislation. That report is ongoing and should be coming out. So, one way that you sort of advance research on this is to keep doing the research and sort of just moving the needle a little bit at a time, and trying to triangulate different studies so that you're getting a better overall picture of the phenomenon. We also, again, want to recognize that our findings demonstrated that missing persons is most disproportionately impacting African American communities in Nebraska, and this is probably an area that is critical for future research. It was just beyond the scope of the LB 154 study. So I'll end with some next steps, and then we'd love to hear questions, comments, have conversations with folks about this ongoing research. So as Dr. Wright indicated, we do have ongoing funding from the National Institute of Justice to really start digging into some of the recommendations of the report, and to study this problem in a more holistic fashion, sort of going beyond law enforcement responses and the things that would be actionable from a law enforcement perspective. Again, we do understand that talking to law enforcement is important, and we want to do that, but we also want to hear from service providers, victim service providers, and other criminal justice system personnel. Again, one of our findings was that the majority of reported missing persons are kids, youth, and teens, and we really need to dig into that further, especially when it comes to Native American missing persons. We know that Native American youth are disproportionately involved in the foster care system in Nebraska, and we really need to know if there's a connection. We've started to look at the national adoption and foster care system data for Nebraska. So it's a national data set, but every state reports in. So we've started to look at that data for the last 10 years, and we are seeing some findings that suggest that Native American kids involved in the foster care system are running away from their placements at higher rates than other race ethnicities. So there really could be a connection there. I know there's a presentation on a really cool program that Project Harmony and OPD have, and I think I know there's other stakeholders involved really around supporting missing kids and kids who are running away, repeat runaways, and I'm really interested to hear about that program. I think that could potentially be a recommendation for this this study that we're doing that'll be reported in at the national level. In addition to the work that we're doing around, the data, the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs also has their own next steps. Obviously, they have the power to advocate on behalf of legislation, and so they are planning on seeking legislation around the use of NamUs. Other states, some other states actually mandate that law enforcement put missing persons cases on, they report those up to NamUs. Nebraska is not one of them, but this is legislation that the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs is interested in advocating for. They're also interested in establishing a task force focusing on the underlying challenges that were identified in this study regarding going missing, such as economic challenges, poverty, suicide, child abuse, really a range of social challenges that were identified in the listening sessions. And then also, they're interested in seeking funding to have a permanent person that can really be sort of dedicated to this work in their office. They have a small office, a small staff, and like Nebraska State Patrol, they really did, I think, they made Herculean efforts to support this research and this study and their community members. And so they just really need more capacity. So we just want to end by saying thank you for coming. Thank you to Captain Matt Sutter and the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs for giving us the opportunity to add research capacity to this project, and then obviously the National Institute of Justice for supporting this work. It is really important, and we are excited that work that is happening in Nebraska is going to help build the national evidence around this important problem. So I will stop now, and we'll see if there's any questions.
It looks like we have a question, Tara. Do you see that? How is the Native American community responding to the research? Oh, some more are rolling in.
Do you want me to take that first one, or?
Well, I can tell you that I've been appointed to the U.S. Task Force on Research on Violence Against Native and Alaska Native women and children, I do identify as a member of the Cherokee Nation. And so we had our first task force meeting 2 weeks ago, maybe. And not only were the task force members amazing and wonderful, but many representatives from the National Institute of Justice were there for that all-day meeting and were listening to the concerns that the task force members brought forward. And of course, mine was about this issue, missing and murdered Indigenous women and children. And I kind of outlined in that talk, in my little blurb, how and why research needs to move forward, right, on this issue. And I think not only the task force members, they would message me or they would come back to some of my comments throughout the talk, and they really echoed that this is a big problem. It's an important thing to really try to get a handle on. But one of the things that is really resonating, I think, is among community members is the underlying causes of this issue. And I think this is a really important thing to bring forward to the audience is we're not able in our study to understand or to examine the ways in which domestic violence, substance use, human trafficking, things like that, poverty, impact or may impact going missing and or missing and murdered Indigenous women and children. And I think that is an important next step, one that does need to be looked at, because I think it's clear from the community members, at least, that this is definitely worth looking into. There's something about this that we need to understand in order to provide more prevention efforts around, I think. So I think they appreciate the research. I think they appreciate being talked to, having their voices heard, right? I think that's a really important piece. And being able to speak out about this issue. So Tara, did I miss anything?
Well, I think it's also important to just be clear about our roles. So, Emily and I were here to bring research capacity to do the research. So to help, to collect the data and analyze the data and provide, cohesive results. But we are definitely not here to tell Native American communities what to do with this information, right? Or to tell law enforcement what to do with this information. That is not our role as social scientists. And I really think that's important to be really transparent about, because, we don't purport to be experts on these communities at all, or to speak on behalf of these communities. I really am excited about continuing to dig into this data using the support from the National Institute of Justice to continue to be able to give more data and information to communities and to service providers for them to then use in their work, right? And they're going to use it however it best fits with their work, right? So the data around youth, there are lots of great practitioners working in juvenile services, working around Nebraska's ICWA legislation. Obviously, the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs, they need this information, they need this data, and then they're going to use it in the ways that make sense for their community. So I guess I just want to be really clear that in some sense we are just adding the research capacity, and then we're handing it over to the people that do the real work that are in the community. And the work is not done. The community partners, so the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs, the folks over at Legal Aid, You know, Nebraska State Patrol, I know that they see this as a very first step, right? Just to start digging into the problem. This was not the end, this was just the beginning. So we had another question about, let's see, have you thought about or started to incorporate your program with human trafficking to attempt to find numbers on Native American victims? Okay, so just to be clear, the programming on human trafficking that we talked about, so there's a Nebraska State Patrol has a training program that they're extending to tribal law enforcement officers. So I believe that's probably what this person is talking about. Emily and I don't have anything to do with that. We would love to be helpful if we could, if there are folks out there in the audience that you know, need help collecting data or you know, examining the impact of programs. We, you know, UNO and the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, I mean, we take our, you know, state metro research institution mission very, you know, it's very important to us. So we are here to help the community as social scientists, but we are not involved in that program or in evaluating its impact. We also have a question about NamUs, what it does and how we can use it now. So that's a great question. So briefly, NamUs is the National Missing Persons List. You can Google it and see. I mean, you can Google it and you can look at the information for missing persons in Nebraska as of today, if you want, right? And you can see the pictures of missing persons and their information. You can report in a missing persons case. So there's a public facing portal where you can actually submit information as a community member or a non-law enforcement officer. Someone who is not a law enforcement officer, you can submit information. It goes into the data system, but it wouldn't be live, so the public wouldn't be able to see it until it's cross-checked, until it's sort of, I guess, approved, for lack of a better word, by a law enforcement agency. So law enforcement are the, you know, officers are the only ones that can report or NamUs personnel, right? Because coroners can also report in, because it's not just missing persons, but it's also unidentified persons. So there's sort of a host of actors that can report information that then goes live. But if you are a community member reporting in, you would put the information in, and then it would need to be it would not go live until a law enforcement officer actually made it live, or, you know, a coroner made it live. And, you know, it's helpful though, because if, for example, you have a loved one that's gone missing, you put their information in, and this includes things like tattoos, birthmarks, moles, other you know, physical features. You put this information in, and then perhaps your loved one has a mental health challenge, right? And they show up in a hospital in Iowa, right? And law enforcement is called. They go to put the information that they're looking for this person in the Iowa missing persons list. It's not on there, right? Because they went missing from Nebraska. They look on NamUs, and here it is. Here's all the information about your loved one with their physical features, and they say, hey, I mean, this could be the person that is missing in Nebraska, right? And it helps make that connection between jurisdictions. And this is, I think this is especially important given the fact that, you know, we have other states right there. And when it comes to the Asian majority, you know, you're a kid in Nebraska at 19, you go right across the border, or at 18, you go right across the border in Iowa, you're not a kid anymore, right? So, you know, if we have somebody that goes missing, or you know, a kid that runs away, for example, and leaves the state and goes into a state where they're an adult, it can get very complicated in regard to whether or not that person is on the missing persons list or identified as a juvenile versus an adult. And so that's why that national database can be so helpful in really sort of tracking information about missing persons as they might move jurisdictions. So I'm also going to put in my email just in this box because I know that some of you are law enforcement and some of you are victim service providers, and Dr. Wright and I are very interested in talking to you about how your agency serves the loved ones of missing persons, or how you might imagine your agency doing that work. So if we have a list of folks that we're going to be contacting, but I'm sure it's not exhaustive. And so if you were sitting in this presentation saying, oh, I have something to contribute, we would love to hear from you, because the purpose of our work, again, is to gather the information and then give it back to the community and to practitioners and service providers to improve the response to missing persons cases, to improve the investigations, reporting, and service. So please give us a shout, and we would love to talk to you. So any other questions?
I put my email in as well under the Connects Me. But Tara's really the brains of the operation, so contact her first.
We really appreciate all the thank yous. We were thrilled to talk about the study. So again, the study report, the data, and then these presentation slides will all be, or the data and the report are already up there. They're on our UNO website, and after, I don't know, hopefully the next hour or so, the slides will also be up there. So please, feel free to contact us later if you have questions or thoughts. We're happy to keep the conversation going.